This is a revision presentation on the concept of minimum efficient scale. The first thing to understand when thinking about minimum efficient scale is actually the notion of productive efficiency. By productive efficiency we mean the point at which production is taking place at its lowest costs. And then we simply work from that to understand minimum efficient scale as being the range of output, the range of production, at which long-run average costs are kept to that minimum. So you can think of it as that when firms are producing at that minimum efficient scale, that they're producing with productive efficiency. We end up with a level that is our minimum efficient scale because of economies and diseconomies of scale. Now, obviously there are various sources of both economies and diseconomies of scale. This presentation is not going to focus on those. However, they are significant to the idea of minimum efficient scale. This is because initially what we expect to happen is a firm will benefit from economies of scale. And when you're benefiting from economies of scale, your long-run average costs are falling. But then at some point, the firm will actually start to suffer instead from diseconomies of scale. And when you're suffering from diseconomies of scale, long-run average costs are increasing instead. When we draw this out in terms of a diagram, we get our familiar looking U-shaped long-run average cost curve. And when long-run average costs are falling, as we said, the firm is benefiting from economies of scale, so we're seeing those falling long-run average costs. Then at some point the firm will start to suffer instead from diseconomies of scale. And when they're suffering from diseconomies of scale, instead now long-run average costs are increasing. So then we pick out as that productively efficient point, the point at which long-run average costs are at a minimum. And that's our minimum efficient scale. Now, how we've shown it on this diagram is that there's just one point at which long-run average costs are at a minimum. But it is worth noting that often this will be across a wide range of values, and then we'll get a kind of flat bit at the bottom of our U-shaped long-run average cost curve. Now, there are important implications of minimum efficient scale, in particular with regard to market structure. The reason for this is if you have a higher level of output that's required to reach that minimum efficient scale, then actually you won't get as much competition. Now, the reason for this is if you have a high level of minimum efficient scale, if that's quite high compared to the size of the market, then you won't be able to have that many firms that are producing at productive efficiency within that market. So let's take, for example, a market of cars, and we have, for example, 10 cars that are being produced. If the minimum efficient scale is 2, then we can fit in 5 firms that will be producing with productive efficiency. But if the minimum efficient scale was 5 instead, well, with the market size of 10, we can only then fit in a maximum of 2 firms who are producing with productive efficiency. So that's why we expect to see that when the minimum efficient scale is higher, then the likelihood is we'll have fewer firms that can produce within that market with productive efficiency, and so we're going to get fewer firms competing and so less competition. We're coming back to the idea here that the more firms there are competing in a market, the more competition we'll have. And so then we can also think about the minimum efficient scale itself as being a form of a barrier to entry. If you have to reach a high level of output in order to start producing efficiently, then actually in order to reach that efficient level of production you're going to have to accumulate a lot of capital, you're going to have to rapidly expand the size of the business. And that of course is always a barrier to entry. There could be implications in terms of finance, there could be worries over sunk costs, and in general having to reach a high level of output to reach efficiency will be something that discourages new firms from coming in, so it's going to be a barrier to entry. And then we could also use the notion of minimum efficient scale to relate it to the concept of a natural monopoly. It might be the case that the minimum efficient scale is so high compared to the actual size of the market that actually we get this case of a natural monopoly. Actually there's only one firm that can fit now into this market and be productively efficient, in which case that's where our concept of natural monopoly comes from, and again we're relating the market structure to the degree of the minimum efficient scale within that market.